All right, y'all. Well, I think at least for a little while, we're going to kind of make this a part of our practice on Wednesday night to spend some time praying together. And on that note, I would encourage you to kind of bounce around tables and hear some different needs from different folks, to pray with some different folks. But if you got your Bible with you, I invite you to open it, and we're going to spend our time tonight in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy chapter 5. Now, this is a super interesting text for a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons it's interesting is that this is the second giving of the Ten Commandments in the Bible. Did y'all know that the Ten Commandments were in the Bible twice? I honestly don't know if I realized this till I went to seminary. It took me a little bit to figure this out. Now, what's really interesting about this is that they're not in the Bible twice identically. The second copy is a little bit different than the first, and the differences are worth spending some time talking about and kind of zooming in on to see what's going on here. So, as we begin our time, I just want to ask you guys for what you think. I'm going to move up. I'm getting a little feedback in my ear. Let's have a little discussion. Why do you guys think that the Ten Commandments are in the Bible twice? Any thoughts on that? Okay, Ron said it's another generation. Say a little more about that, Ron. Yeah, so it's a whole new group of people that wasn't present for the first giving of the Ten Commandments. Good. Other thoughts? Yes. Yeah, of all the things that happen in Moses' life, I mean, the Ten Commandments are, I don't know if they're number one, but they're way up there, right? You got the Red Sea and maybe the plagues and the Ten Commandments, right? They're way up there. That's a great thought, John. Anything else? John? You saying they need to be reminded? Yes. Once is not enough, right? It's like with my toddlers, I can't tell you something where I just told them once and they figured it out, right? They were good to go. That's not how we are. Good thoughts, y'all. So I think it's just a good sort of principle of biblical interpretation. If God repeats himself, it's worth paying attention to. Asking, why did he do this? Why did he say this twice? Why is this here? And so I agree with a lot of what you guys said, that first of all, as Ron pointed out, we've got a whole new generation. They were not there at Sinai. But more than that, it's not just a new generation, they're in a new context. The Israelites at Sinai were preparing to wander in the wilderness, right? But the Israelites here in Deuteronomy are preparing to settle down in the Promised Land. And so this is a whole new context, new life in which to keep these rules. And so one thing that this teaches us right off the bat is that the application of biblical principles and biblical doctrine may vary, may change, depending on what circumstance of life we're in. But the principles always apply, right? Wherever you are, whatever you're going through, especially these 10 commandments, these 10 rules for life, they're going to apply, right? So as we look through these tonight, as I said, what we're mainly going to do is focus on the differences between Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And so for the ones that are the same or largely the same, I'm going to kind of breeze through them. But if I'm breezing over one of the 10 commandments that you want to focus on and spend some time talking about, flag me down and we'll spend as much time on that as y'all want to, okay? All right, would somebody begin reading for us Deuteronomy 5, 1 through 5. Deuteronomy 5, 1 through 5. Thank you, Becky. So, we're not yet into the 10 Commandments, but there are 3 commandments that are given here just in verse 1. What are they? Listen, hear, and learn. Okay, we heard 2 of these last week. No pun intended there, but we heard hear and do last week. Learn is new. And I thought this was very interesting as I was studying this week. The Hebrew word learn is very common in the Hebrew language. In all of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, this is the only place that it occurs, right here in Deuteronomy 5. Of all the things that Moses wrote, this is the one time that the word learn pops up. Now, why do you guys think that is? Why here and nowhere else? Yes, very good. And as Dr. Hurley pointed out in the intro to this book, one of the main functions of the book of Deuteronomy is to be like a catechism, something that is taught to children, that is learned by children. And so the presence of this word here in Deuteronomy 5 is sort of giving us a clue. Here's what this book is for. It's to be learned, to be imbibed, right? So as Moses is giving these 10 commandments a second time, the people are to do 3 things. They're to listen to him as he speaks. They're to learn the commandments and then live them out, right? This is to be part of their life. Now, in verses 2 through 5, Moses makes an interesting claim. He claims that the covenant between God and Israel was not made, quote, with our fathers, but, quote, with us who are all of us alive here today. Does that strike y'all as strange? Why? It actually seems false, doesn't it? Because who was the covenant made with, Ron? With their fathers. Okay. Whenever this phrase, our fathers, is used in the book of Deuteronomy, it's not referring to the parents of the people who are being spoken to. What do y'all know? Who does the fathers tend to refer to in the Old Testament? The patriarchs, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So here's actually what Moses is saying. Moses is saying that these people, the people of Israel, are unique. God made many promises to the patriarchs, right? He promised them land and descendants, all these things. But the patriarchs didn't live to see those promises fulfilled, right? They died waiting on those promises to come true. But here, the people of Israel, they're special. Not only has God made promises to them, they're about to see the promises come true. God has promised them land, and they're about to go in. They're about to see the realization of that promise. In other words, God's unique blessing on the people of Israel should spur them on to obedience and to holy living, right? They're getting a very unique privilege in realizing this promise during their lifetimes. And we can think about this for a moment. This was probably especially poignant to Moses because he was one of the people of Israel to whom this promise has been made, that they're going to go in and live in the promised land, and yet he's not going to go in. Right? He's got to die outside the promised land. And so we can imagine this being difficult for him even to communicate to his people, right? Now, I think we can make a really important parallel to our Christian lives here. For most of recorded history, God's people were saved by putting their faith in a Messiah who was to come in the future, right? All of their hope for their salvation was in a future Messiah, a future promise of God who had not come yet. But as New Testament Christians, you and I have put our hope in a realized promise of God, a Messiah who has come, Jesus who has lived and walked among us, who has died, who has risen for our salvation, and we have this wonderful book that testifies to us of this accomplished promise of God. We can know it's true, so here's my point. if the Israelites should obey God because they received the promised land, how much more should you and I, as New Testament Christians, obey God because we've received the promised Messiah, right? How much greater is that realized promise as opposed to the promised land? I don't know for you how conscious your sin or obey process is. Y'all know what I'm talking about? So you come upon a temptation in your life, and the choice you have is, am I going to obey God here, or am I going to go my own way? All of us go through this. I don't know how conscious it is for you. It varies for me. But it seems to me that the more conscious we can make that process, the better off we'll be. Because if we get in the habit of asking ourselves, why should I obey God in this area of my life or in that area of my life, it seems that Jesus is more than enough answer to that question. That what God has done for you in Christ is more than enough reason for you to be obedient to whatever He has told you to do in any area of your life. So I would encourage you guys to, this tends to be the case that the more you and I fall in love with Jesus, the more obedient we get, the more we want to and long to obey the things that the Lord has told us to do. All right, we're going to jump into these commandments here. We're going to have some fun with this. Somebody read Deuteronomy 5, 6 through 11. Thank you, John. So these three commandments, these first three commandments, are identical or nearly identical to their giving in Exodus chapter 20. And so I'm not planning on spending a lot of time going over them, but if you guys would like to talk about any of these three, or if you have any questions about these three, raise your hand and we'll walk through them. Anything on the first three commandments? Okay. Would somebody read for us Deuteronomy 5, 12 through 15? Thanks, Ron. All right. This commandment, the fourth commandment, is substantially different in Deuteronomy than it is in Exodus. Some of y'all are shaking your heads. And I tell you what, if you would like to, let's do this. Keep a thumb here in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and flip back to the book of Exodus chapter 20 so that you can see the difference. And we're going to kind of walk through this together. Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. The fourth commandment in Exodus 20 begins in verse 8. What's the first thing you guys notice that's different between Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 and the fourth commandment? Susan. Very good, Susan. So one of the things that's different is what we would call the rationale, the explanation behind the fourth commandment. So I think the Israelites, you and me, were very much like my toddlers, and when God says do something, sometimes the first thing we ask is, why? So God tells us up front, right? And in Exodus, the rationale, as Susan read, is that God kept the Sabbath at creation. Therefore, you should keep the Sabbath, okay? But in Deuteronomy 5, what did, I already forgot who read. Susan, yeah. What's the rationale there in Deuteronomy 5 as to why we should keep the Sabbath? Is it, no, I wasn't asking you specifically. It's in verse 15. Here, I can read it for us. You shall remember. Yes, okay. Now let's talk about this. What in the world does slavery have to do with keeping the Sabbath? Of all the things that God could have picked, why that? Tell us some more, Linda. 365, right? So in that context of a people who have been enslaved, what is the Sabbath? It's a gift. It's a gift of a day off. What? They didn't know what a day off was, right? Now, why did the rationale change from Exodus to Deuteronomy? Why does God give this? We would actually maybe expect Him to give the slavery rationale in Exodus, but He gives it in Deuteronomy. Why do you guys think that is? Carter said they're a little more distant. Say some more, Carter. Yes. So they're forgetful, for sure. What else do you guys think? That's right. This is a new generation, right? And so they don't know. The previous generation maybe was so excited about the Sabbath because it never had a day off that their reminder was just remember, right? In other words, don't fall into your old pattern of working all the time because that's what you're used to. But for these guys, they didn't even know, right? They've not experienced what it's like to go 24/7, 365 and never have a break. Okay. Now, as we think about this transition that's taken place, right, from Exodus to Deuteronomy, we can do the same thing from Deuteronomy to our own day, right? Again, the context has changed, the context is different. I want to offer you a few more thoughts about the change in rationale. Do you guys think it would be easier to keep the Sabbath in the wilderness, where they'd been keeping it, between Exodus and Deuteronomy? Or is it easier to keep it in the Promised Land, where they'll be after Deuteronomy 5? Marvin says in the wilderness. Why do you think that, Marvin? Yes. There's so much, and I love Marvin put that in a really simple way that makes a lot of sense to me. Just all the stuff to look at, right? And you're just going to get lost in it. Here's a sort of practical example of this. Do you guys find it easier to keep the Sabbath on vacation or when you're at home? When you're traveling or when you're at home? At home. They're going to be moving through this land, right? With all this stuff to look at, all this stuff to do. That's great, Marvin. Other thoughts as to why maybe it's harder to keep the Sabbath in the Promised Land than in the wilderness? just wonder, what else are we going to do besides keep the Sabbath, right? That's great, Ron. They're going to have all these new responsibilities. Yeah. John, you raising your hand?
Put up a tent on Saturday, they can chill on Sunday. When they go to the promised land, they got a house. The roof leaked on Saturday, but they have to fix it on Sunday.
It's just all this new stuff. Yes. I want to give y'all a couple. They had soccer games. That's right. Ron, that's what in preacher's world, that's what we call going to meddling, right? Now we've crossed over. Here's a couple more thoughts for y'all. I think that this new generation, as Linda said, that hasn't experienced slavery themselves, they're going to be tempted to make slaves in the promised land. They're going to be conquering all these people. They're going to have all these neighbors, right? They're going to be tempted to make slaves themselves. And furthermore, and maybe very applicable to America in 2024, they're going to be tempted to make slaves of themselves because you have all this stuff to do. The roof's leaking, the crops need tending to, all this work to do, and the temptation's going to arise. Wouldn't it be nice to have one more day to get stuff done on? To not keep the Sabbath. Now, you know this temptation. I do too. Right? It comes at us once every 7 days because it would be really nice to have another few hours, another day to get the stuff done that we need to. And I'm sure that the Israelites had a way, like we do, of justifying this because maybe the things that we want to work on are really good things. They're things that really do need doing, right, et cetera, et cetera. But what we don't rationalize, what we don't talk about, is somewhere in that process, we start to believe that somehow we've gotten a little bit wiser than God, and He told us to rest one day in 7, but maybe we know a little better, and we got a couple things that really need doing, right? It's very easy to do this. It's very subtle, and it's easy to end up in a place where we have made slaves out of ourselves, right, and let this commandment go. And so I think now we've got these 2 reasons already to keep the Sabbath. The first one is because God keeps the Sabbath. And this is sort of a crass way to put it, but it seems to me that if it's good enough for God, it ought to be good enough for us, right? If the Lord took a day of rest on the Sabbath, we probably should too. And then second of all, He's saying, I saved you from Egypt, from slavery, so that you could keep the Sabbath, so that you could enjoy it. Take advantage of the gift. On another note, to sort of shift gears on this, as we think about keeping the Sabbath in our own day, we've had a really significant change of circumstances. Jesus, who is the new Moses, has come, and He's come to set us free, not from Egypt, but from our sin. He died on a cross, and He rose 3 days later on Sunday morning that we might enjoy not a Sabbath just once every 7 days, but a Sabbath in heaven that goes on forever, that never ends, rest eternal. And so on Sunday, I want to reframe the Sabbath for you guys a little bit tonight. As New Testament Christians on Sunday, what we're actually doing is we're coming together to celebrate the work that Jesus has done so that we might rest, the work that He has done for our salvation, so that we can rest and not have to do that work. And so for us as New Testament Christians, the rest comes first, not last. I want us to think about this. This is really significant. In the Old Testament, what day of the week was the Sabbath? Saturday. It's the last day of the week, right? In the New Testament, what day of the week is the Sabbath? It's the first, okay? So y'all watch this. This is so important for us to understand. There is a massive difference between resting last and resting first. I took a vacation a few weeks ago, and I had been just going for a long time, had not taken any time off. And so for the first 3 days or so of my vacation, I was just recovering from all the work that I had been doing, right? I was just trying to rest and recuperate from all the work and all the ministry that had been done. But then by the end of my vacation, by the last 2 or 3 days of my vacation, I wasn't recuperating. I was recharging my batteries and getting excited to come back and do the work that was in front of me, the ministry that was in front of me, right? So that I could come back to you guys renewed, not just in body, but in mind and in spirit, and come back with energy and excited. So here's the deal. The Sabbath on the last day of the week is like the first couple days of my vacation, where you're just trying to recuperate from what's already passed, the work you've already done. But the Sabbath on the first day of the week is like those last few days of my vacation. So Sunday for us as New Testament Christians is a time that we come together to recharge our batteries, to be thankful for what God has done, and to get charged up for the work that He's got for us to do the rest of the week. And it's not work that we do to earn our salvation. It's work that we do in thanks for the work God has already done. And so I hope that helps reframe the Sabbath for y'all a little bit. The New Testament Sabbath is an awesome gift. I think recharging our batteries is just a really good way to think about what Sunday is for. Marvin?
I look at it differently. I look at God is really busy.
Yeah.
So he took a rest.
Yes.
But I'm not so sure that I believe God takes a day off now. He's watching everybody every day, knows what's going on in the whole world. So I'm not so sure
It's good.
he takes a day off.
Good. So this is actually a really important thing to talk about. Do you guys think God needs a day off? Most certainly not. We read in the Bible, right, that He never sleeps nor slumbers. It's one of the confidences we have in our God. So why do we think then that in Genesis, as the paradigm for the rest of history, God takes a day off? What's that about? We need it, right? And so He's the example for us in this. And Marvin, to your point, one of the things that Jesus is criticized for while He's on earth is He keeps doing stuff on the Sabbath, right? He has the audacity to heal somebody on the Sabbath and to pick some grain, these horrible things that Jesus does. And so the idea of Sunday, of Sabbath, is not idleness. It's not that God does nothing or that we do nothing, but it's different sorts of things that we do, right? And Marvin, to be totally fair to your point, it is very difficult to grasp what it might look like for God to do even different sorts of things, right? He's God. And yet somehow we sort of wrestle with this example we have. God did this, so you do this, right? Really good stuff though, Marvin. Okay, next thing we're going to look at, somebody read chapter 5, verses 16 through 21. That's good, thank you. So I'm not going to comment a lot on these. These are largely the same. There's some real minor variations. But I think this is interesting. In Hebrew, this series of commands, beginning in verse 17 and going through, I know 19, maybe 20, it's just 2 words in Hebrew. Dr. Hurley, you may know off the top of your head, do we just have 2 words in verse 20 as well? Or is there more there? In 20, bear false witness. So anyway, at least in these few commandments, just imagine, to roughly translate it in English, verse 17, no murder. Verse 18, no adultery. Verse 19, no stealing. There's a simplicity there that is just absolute. Don't do these things. There are not caveats, there are not exceptions. Don't do them, right? And I think it's maybe especially helpful to think of in the area of adultery, right? We like to try and caveat and, well, does this count and that count? God just says don't do it, period. No caveats, no exceptions. just don't, right? And so I think as we're reflecting on these, the absoluteness, the expansiveness of these commandments is very helpful. Okay, I'm going to read verse 21. We're going to jump into this one last of all. And you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, or his male servant or his female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything else that is your neighbor's. Now, y'all go back over, if you still got your thumb there, to Exodus 20. We've got a difference, two actually. This one's a little harder to see. The difference in the 10th commandment is the order changes. See if y'all pick up on it when I read it. I'm going to read the Exodus version. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything else that is your neighbor's. What's the change? Wife and house change positions. Y'all think that's an accident, or maybe Moses is just preaching and he just flips it? Okay, talk a little bit about that, John. Say it again and say some more. Okay. So, now, but that almost is, yeah, it's almost problematic, because if they don't have houses, why put the houses first in Exodus? That's sort of interesting, isn't it? We would almost expect it to be the other way, right? Other thoughts? Susan. Yes, now that's an interesting difference as well. And if you'll hold that for a second, we're going to jump into that. So why in Deuteronomy wife before house? I'm going to be very honest with y'all. There's no absolute answer to this. I just want us to think.
I was going to say the last 40 years we've seen more covenant your neighbor's wife than covenant your neighbor's house.
Now, there's a very good thought there. I'm reading this book right now as we study through this. It's called The Gospel According to Moses. It's a very good book. Would recommend it, actually. But one of the things that he argues in this book, we think of Moses as the lawgiver in Deuteronomy. That's really not quite right. Who's the lawgiver? God. Moses in Deuteronomy functions much more like a pastor than a lawgiver. And so to John's point, this would be a pastoral concern. As Moses has pastored Israel, the issue that comes up more is adultery. So don't covet your neighbor's wife. He's putting emphasis on it. I love that thought. Yeah. Yeah, so there is, and don't let me stray from it. I'm going to come back to it. I want to finish this one and we'll come back to it. So here's my musing this week, and I'm just going to throw it out there. It's very similar to what John said. I think maybe there's a proximity concern here, and here's what I mean. They've been traveling, okay? So as you travel, maybe for a little while you camp next to this guy and his wife, but then maybe something happens, or you're a little faster, they're a little slower, so then you camp next to this guy and his wife for a while. In other words, there's going to be some changing around of who your neighbors are, okay? But in the Promised Land, you're going to have neighbors, people that you've built a house to and you live next to for a long time. In other words, what I'm getting at is you're going to get to know your neighbor's wife a little better, maybe, in the Promised Land than you did in the wilderness. And so there's going to be more opportunity in this new circumstance to covet your neighbor's wife, right? And so that's very similar to John's concern. That's kind of my musing on this as to maybe why the order's been flipped. There is no hard answer on this. Yes, ma'am. No. Right. Right. And so this is yeah, right? This is a difference, yes. All right, now I'm going to bounce to Susan, then Ron, I'm going to come back to you. So Susan caught the other difference in this text. We have the addition of the word field or land as a thing not to be coveted. Now, why? This one has an easy answer.
Because they're now gonna have.
That's right. Now you got fields and lands. You didn't before, right? It was just wherever you were camping that day. And so Moses is saying, hey, I know you guys are excited about this. If you think your neighbors, well, here you go, literally, if you think the grass is greener on the other side, don't covet that. It's not, right? Okay, now, Ron, let me come back to you. Ron asked, is there significance in the order to the Ten Commandments? The answer is yes, right? The first 3 commandments concern our relationship with who? God. Sorry, first 4. Now, the 5th is interesting. Who does the 5th commandment concern our relationship with? It's a familial, parents and children, but the question is, and this is sticky in a fun way, is that a vertical concern or a horizontal concern? It's both. And so we see why it's placed 5th. It's the transition, because what are 6 through 10 concerned with? Our relationships with each other, right? And so 5th is sort of this transitional commandment because, in a very real sense, we can use me as an example. To my children, I stand in the place of God, just in some real way, right? I am sort of the authority figure in the home, the provider, and also the person who communicates God to them, right? And so we have this sort of transitory commandment there in the 5th. Okay, last thing we're going to jump into tonight before we wrap up. Somebody read chapter 5, verses 22 through 27. Yes, sir, 22 through 27.
These words were spoken to all the assembly of the mountain out of the midst of the fire. The cloud and the thick darkness with a loud voice. And he added no more. They wrote them down on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. And as soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, came near to me, all the heads of the tribes and the elders, and he said, Behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. This day we have seen God and speak with man, and man is still living. Now therefore, why should we die? This great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of our Lord God anymore, we shall die. But we is there of all flesh, we have heard the voice of the Lord God speaking out of the midst of the fire to the earth, and still live. So hear and hear all that the Lord our God will say, and speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you, if you will hear and do.
Thanks, Carter. So Moses is telling this new generation about what it was like to get the 10 Commandments the first time, right? To hear God speak his law the first time. How would you guys summarize in one word what that experience was like? Terrifying. Terrifying. Here are some of the words that he uses. Blazing fire, darkness, gloom, a voice that could not be endured. That's terrifying, right? Now, why? Why is Moses reminding this new generation of this? Doesn't seem very encouraging. What's the point? What do you mean by reverence, John? That's a good word.
I said it's terrifying, it is, there's a good kind. There's a kind of fear that makes you respect. And
And why does this new generation need to be reminded of that?
Because again, they want to stay there. And they need to understand
Yes.
and why they are there.
Yes. So their, I'm going to use I know it's been a confusing word tonight, but their fathers, right, had this experience. They didn't. But they need to know that the God they're serving is that God. It's the same one. He's the giver of these 10 commandments. And so just listen again to these words. I'm going to read a portion of 24 and 25. This day we have seen God speak with man, and man still live. If we hear the voice of God anymore, we shall die. That was the testimony of their parents. And so he's urging this new generation to obey this holy and awesome God, who is, yes, this terrifying, but on the other hand, who's come down and spoken with them and blessed them and dealt with them, right? So here's where I want us to wrap up tonight. In Hebrews chapter 12, the author is going to draw a comparison between the revelation of God at Mount Sinai and the revelation of God in Jesus. Y'all flip over there with me as I read this. Hebrews chapter 12, and I'm going to pick up reading in verse 18. Listen to what he's doing as I read this. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them, for they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. So New Testament Christians, that is not your experience of God. Here's what your experience of God is. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. But watch this. Your experience of God is very different. But here's the conclusion. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. Here's what the author of Hebrews is saying. He's saying, no, you didn't have the terrifying experience of God. You had the wonderful experience of Jesus, the kind, full, loving revelation of God. But that doesn't lessen the burden on you for obedience. It actually raises it. You have had this full, lovely revelation of God. If the Israelites in the wilderness should have obeyed because of what they saw, how much more should you obey because of what you have seen and experienced in Jesus? All right, y'all, we got about 2 minutes. Y'all hit me with a question or two, a thought or two that you had from the 10 Commandments Deuteronomy version, and I'll tell you what we're going to do next week.
Well, I don't know, maybe you were in the last Hebrews 12 there. Because that passage does end on a fearful note.
Yes, it does.
Very, it's not, God is still going to consuming fire.
Yes. It's the same God, right? So if they should have listened, how much more should you, given that the consuming fire has now sent you his only Son, right? Dr. Hurley? Yes. 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 Mm. Yes. Yeah. Mm. It's almost like a literary highlighter of wife. Here, standing by itself. Yes. That's really good. It's a pastoral and literary highlight of please pay attention to this thing. This is very important. That's a good takeaway. All right, y'all. I want to give you next week's sort of menu, and then we're going to wrap up. So next week we will eat dinner just like always, and then we're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to do an Operation Christmas Child packing party. So the youth just got back, and they bought almost $600 worth of stuff for us to pack Operation Christmas Child boxes with. So if you donated to that, thank you so much. That's going to be awesome. Our goal is to fill 100 boxes. Jenny, how are we feeling about our ability to fill 100 boxes? All right, Jenny says she doesn't think so. So here's my goal for next week. I want Jenny to be really wrong. Okay, that's what I'm shooting for. We can make that happen. Jenny, what do we need? Okay. Okay. Do we have any? Okay. Are we like real short on any particular kind of filling items? Balls. Okay. Okay. Sure. All right, so that's an easy one. Everybody come with a package of balls next week. We can do that. Phyllis, yeah? Okay. Okay. Phyllis's number, if you need it, you can get in touch with the church office or find her, and she's going to be sorting. So we're going to have a blast next week. Baby dolls. All right, let's do this. Here's what we're going to do. Everybody watch. Okay. If you're on this side of the room, note where you are, okay? You guys are on ball duty, okay? This side of the room, baby dolls. All right, everybody bring something when you come next week, and we are going to pack 100 Operation Christmas Child